Welcome to the Change Book Podcast. My name is Rachel Best, and this is our co-host.
I'm Nicole Harvick.
And this is the Change Book series. It is the fastest growing self-empowerment book series on the planet.
This spans over 30 countries, and we now bring them all together in a powerful podcast destined to change people from all corners of the globe.
So go ahead and grab your pen and paper because our guest today is going to share a lot of amazing tips and inspiration that you're definitely going to want to write down.
Well, good morning, everyone. If you're seeing me, you know it's Monday. And as always, we have a wonderful co-author on. And today I feel that this is something really special because I truly feel like Jim and Jim created a family here. So what we do is we go back and we find authors and we want to see what they've been doing, where they're going with this, what have they accomplished. And that's what we're going to do today with Dr. Karen Kramer. So Karen, welcome to the show. How are you?
Very good, Nicole. Thank you. It's good to be back.
You know what? I'm always so happy to talk to you because, first of all, you have such a dynamic personality that it's really fun. You get me going and excited. And one of the things I will say is I'm so grateful to you because you wrote a book about grief just recently and it's been published. And you asked me to be a contributor in that book. And it was about having a stillbirth. And that was something that happened in 2001 that I had never really talked about. I processed it and, I came to terms with it, but I never thought I'd be writing or talking about it. And I was really amazed at some of the things that were maybe triggers or stuck in me that seemed to be released when I actually faced it a little more head on and shared it. What do you think about that?
Well, I am so glad that you did at that time because you became one of the 30 grief survival case studies in healthy grief. So thank you for that. And to your point, yes, even to the tagline of the book, which is normalizing and navigating loss and a culture of toxic positivity. So normalizing and navigating. So the more in which we share our stories, the more in which it does two things. One, for us, it allows us to not be shamed by and again, this can be in different contexts for different people, depending upon their different types of loss. But instead of like holding it back, which is part of that toxic positivity. Oh, I shouldn't share this. I may bring people down. They don't want to hear that. So it allows us to be able to release that and share that and be open with other people. The other part on the other people's side is you never know who it's going to positively impact. And I'll give you an example. So after I was on with both you and Rachel shared her own story, I reached out to both of you because I was in the process of writing the book at the time and asked both of you if you would share your stories. So when you shared your story, I'm still getting chills right now. You shared your story. Not long after that, I was also walking with a dear friend of mine from high school. And I was telling her about the book and everything that was coming along. And at that point in time, it wasn't just about stories. I was just telling her about the framework of the book and how it came to be, which started with some of the clients I was working with. And she kind of dropped just a little hint of something and like a half a sentence of something and then continued on talking da 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 da. And I know when people are talking, like allow them to share. And she kind of drifted off in a different direction. And about a half an hour later, when we finished our walk, I said, thank you. And her name is Karen. And so as well. And so I said to her, I'm like, okay, thank you, Karen. I said, you mentioned something here, a while ago. And she goes, oh, what was that? And I said, here was the phrase that you mentioned. I don't even remember the phrase. I said, here's a phrase that you mentioned. And she kind of paused, like she was trying to reel it back. And then she got this knowing look on her face, but the look on her face was almost like, should I share that? Almost like, ooh, that was my secret. Should I share that? And again, we're dear friends, but I didn't know about that. And what she shared was around a time. So she has 3 children, and the last one came along later in life. I don't remember how old she was. I think towards her 40s. But what happened is she also ended up, she would have had, what's the medical term? In there, had to make a critical decision around, what's the name of it? Being able to let go. So not an abortion, but along terminate her pregnancy. Yeah. And because at 16 weeks along, and this is where, so anyway, that was like the story of it. And she started telling me about it, which she hadn't told many people about.
Wow.
And what came to it, and that hard decision that she had to make, which was a medical decision for her health, and knowing at the time that this child more than likely would not be born alive. If it was not going to survive. So being in that situation, and she had not told anybody except for her close family at that point in time. I didn't even know. And so, and I'm still getting chills on that. I said, are you willing to write this story? Are you at a point? Because with anybody that was in writing in my book, I wanted to make sure that they were healthfully enough along that I wasn't going to re-traumatize them by asking them to share their story. So that's where and actually there were a couple people that I actually gracefully turned away because I knew they were still in their deep pain about writing stories. But she was healthfully enough along, and at this point in time, it had been, I don't remember exactly, but it could have been like 15, 20 years. I don't remember the time frame. But she wrote, so one of the things that I did with each of the grief survivors is basically I gave, which you also went through, is I gave a structure of ideas and things to weave through to make it easier to write. So you're actually pulling through some of the concepts that I have in the book. And when I received both her story and your story together, because I didn't know all the details of it, and looked at that, the chills that came from that, and I even commented on it for the readers, that it was almost like 2 different perspectives on the same type of medical situation.
That was interesting. That was very interesting. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing your story, and Karen as well. But one of the things that Karen said to me was, she said, well, who's going to want to hear my story? That was her first response. And I even wrote that in there. Like, who would want to hear that? Like, why me? Why would my story make an impact? And there are others, and I even shared it back to her, and I think I shared it to you as well, who have commented on that story, because more people are coming forward now and saying, hey, I had a similar situation, but I felt shamed by it, or I was so hurt by it that I didn't feel I wanted to share it with others. And to your point that you just made, Nicole, the more we feel comfortable in sharing it with others, not only does it help us further heal and release us from that loss, it also connects with another human being who in many ways can relate in many ways and help them heal as well.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, Karen, what was your catalyst behind this for you personally to feel that you had to do something about this grief?
Well, there's 2 ways in which I can phrase that. So I'm going to go to the most current, and then I'm going to jump back to the other, because timely, at the time of this recording, we're actually recording it just after Father's Day. So it is actually timely for me to share the second piece as well. But I'll start with the first piece. So I actually, here at the time of this recording, 1.5 years ago, swore I was never going to write a book. And part of that was due to an experience I had where I was part of a mastermind where 136 people, I was a guest to a mastermind of 136 people, all of whom were writing books. And as the guest to this mastermind, I was the new meat. So everybody wanted to come up and meet me and get my contact information, which I thought was great from a networking perspective, which then followed with, hey, can I add you to my list? So when my new book comes out on Amazon, you can buy it for 99 cents and give me a fake review. And I'm like, oh, heck. I'm never,
All the time, right? All the time.
never going to write a book. So that really turns me off to writing the book. But as you and I know, the universe keeps on putting things in our path. So soon after that experience, like literally within 2 months after that experience, I had 3 different people in a short period of time, all of whom I was sharing some things that were happening with my clients. And they said, you need to write a book. You need to write a book. You need to write a book. Well, by the 3rd time, the gentleman said, you need to write a book. And oh, by the way, I have a book coach who is for you. So that's how I got into writing it. And it really started with me talking about the experiences that my clients were having. So I've been in leadership development and coaching for over 30 years. And in the last 6 years, I have been focusing much more on working with the subconscious and unconscious mind, and had a wonderful opportunity due to traveling with an organization as the head coach and working with over 1,200 individuals, including my own clients, and seeing the amazing experience that these individuals were having, that when they are releasing those negative emotions and those limiting beliefs, that their body truly is coming back to balance, i.e. healing. And I saw it over and over and over again. So here I had a short period of time where I had 3 clients who I really was focusing more on what their presenting problem was that they came to me. For example, the first one was a woman who had gone through a deep depression. She wasn't diagnosed clinically depressed, but she had depressive-like behaviors. And I'm not one to diagnose people. So she had depressive-like behaviors following a very nasty divorce. Yeah. And when we were doing the work together, she happened to mention, yeah, I have a cyst, and it, cysts come and go, but this one was a cyst on her ovary, and it was so inflamed to the point where she had already scheduled a surgery to have that cyst removed. So again, cysts come and go, and she had already had cysts before, but it was so inflamed, so uncomfortable, and she happened to mention this. And so I noted it and I wrote it down. But again, I wasn't necessarily focused on the medical aspect. I was focusing more on releasing the emotion. So I did a follow-up with her a month later after doing the deep work. And she mentioned to me, she said, the doctor was surprised and I was surprised. She mentioned the word surprise, like 3 different times. And I just noted it. And I finally came back and I said, okay, I said, tell me a little bit more about this surprise, because again, sometimes the cysts recede. And she said, and I don't know whether they actually went in for the surgery or did like an ultrasound before, but she said, no, it actually healed over to the point where you couldn't even tell that the cyst was actually there. Wow. Then what popped out of my mind without consciously thinking of it, of course, because cysts are pockets of unresolved sadness.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of research. You and I know that, even back to, which is one of my Bibles, the Healing Questions Guide. You can tell it's heavily used. It's one of my resources, and also a resource that I use with the 30 grief survival case studies that are in here. Without even going back to that, I knew it had released, because we had released the sadness. Therefore, the body was coming back to balance. So that was the first one. The second was actually a client who came to me because she actually had stage 2 colon cancer. So actually she came to me with the medical as part of it. But what happened, what was underneath that, which she realized is, and I'm snapping my fingers because that's part of that hypnotic release, is that her doctor said, she had asked her doctor, how long has this been in my body? And he said, which again is consistent with some other cancer-related cases, is we just noticed it, but this has been growing in your body for 5 years. Whew. And why she ended up coming to me is because she realized this was 2 months to the 5-year mark when her husband had passed, and she had carried the guilt about not being able to save him.
Wow.
and also doing the work, which this is consistent because she's basically what inspired me, truly inspired me. So I call her my poster child for the book, and her story is in here. It also went back to sexual molestation when she was 6. And I've actually worked with a number of people who have had some form of childhood trauma, sexual trauma specifically, that is settled in the body. And it has brought her body back to balance. So those are the 2 key stories there, when I'm realizing when I'm focusing on grief and why grief, when I sat back and looked at what is the commonality with many of my clients, whether it is divorce, whether it is, I've actually worked with 3 siblings, teenagers, who were sexually molested by 2 older step brother and sister. So that's another kind of loss, grief, a loss of a childhood. Anything, I've had a gentleman who was bullied in a work environment, stepped out of that, then lost his mom. So he was dealing with a lot of grief associated with that. So it was a lot of loss. And when we're dealing with a lot of loss and we're not processing it, then it settles in the neurology of our body, and it can be released at that point in time, but also it can go too far and not be released. And I actually work with a client, stage 2 pancreatic cancer too, where at some point it's just too late for the body to truly come back to balance. So I wanted people to understand, what is grief? It's much more than death and dying. It's any kind of significant loss when what once was is no longer, and it settles in the neurology of the body. So,
right. And it becomes a part of you. It integrates with everything. And it's so interesting because sometimes, because things can be, the subconscious will capture something in early childhood. I've had people that I've had to take them back to find the trauma. One lady was 18 months old, always felt unworthy, always felt unloved. And it went back to something that transpired with her mother when she was 18 months old.
Yes. And it can, I've worked with clients where the trauma has gone back to at birth, to in the womb. I've even had a client who her trauma started when her egg was released from the ovary. And also I've had clients who it's gone back generational as well as lifetime. So it can happen in many different ways in our life. And one of the stories, which gets to the second part I was going to mention too, when asked, why did I write this book? One of the stories that I talk about is something that happened for me when I was 5 years old, that I call Little Miss Karen. And this was a belief that was created by my underdeveloped 5-year-old little mind. I was actually born to my parents later in life. So I didn't realize that my parents were older than what they should be, kind of quote unquote, right? Because, until I went to school. So when I was in kindergarten, when I was 5 years along, kindergarten, my teacher at the time, when my parents came for, school night, whatever it was, they said, "Oh, are those your grandparents?" And somewhere in the back of my mind said, grandparents are old people die. When people die, that means they're not there any longer. My parents are going to die. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So just think about a 5-year-old little brain that puts that together. And so when I was doing this work, again, when I was doing my own work, the work that I do with my clients, it took me back to that point to be able to release not only the limiting belief that was there, as well as the fear associated with it. It took me also back to a scene so that's when the belief was created. But when the fear settled in was soon after that. I woke up on a Saturday morning, clear as day. I can even remember it now, where the sun was setting towards, you can tell it was close to noon, very late on a Saturday morning. And when I woke up, I couldn't find my parents in the house. And I started to panic, and that belief I had created started to just take over my body, my mind, my emotions, everything. And my parents were out in the back. We have 3 1/4 acres. My parents were out in back putting up a great fence for my mom as a gardener. By the time I reached my mom in hysterics, I said, "I thought you died." And so I write about that story in here and in Healthy Grief. And I'm going to say before I continue with the story didn't end there. After I wrote the book, I continued to go back into that story. And it actually was something that came from a recent past life, where at the age of 5, due to a family conflict, which also plays into my story, there was another family member that killed my immediate family, except for me, at the age of 5.
Oh, wow.
So there was a lot more that was into it, that although it manifested in my current life, in that which I just shared with you about my teacher saying something, there is also, and I say this to everybody, there's something that also underneath, due to a past life, was sparking me to pay attention to that comment, and also sparked me making that rationalization there, which also led to a belief that I am alone that showed up. And in this past life, I was alone because the rest of my family was killed. And this fear that I'm going to lose my parents showed up. So when working with my clients, also recognizing that there may be things that are not necessarily, they may present themselves in certain ways in this lifetime, but they also may have different roots prior to being born. Generational shows up, or lifetime, anything. But in here, I shared that story, not the past life part because that showed up later, but in working with my father when he passed away, a month after he passed away, and I tell more about the story, but I love my dad. I was daddy's little girl. And when it came to anything about death, dying, talking about the trust, or the first time my dad was diagnosed with prostate cancer, I was avoidant, irrationally avoidant. Like, I couldn't logically think why. And it was this little 5-year-old little girl. It was the little Miss Karen, the one who had the stories that I just told you about, that started to act, but I wasn't consciously aware of it. It was just recognizing, as I look back, wow, I had a true avoidance to anything related to my dad being ill of any sort, any conversations about dying, such as being the trustee of the trust. When my dad ended up falling and breaking his hip and being in the last stages of his life, in the last 6 months of his life, he passed away at the age of 90, by the way. I love my dad, but it was transactional relationships that I had with him. Most of them were like dealing with the trust and things, because I was distancing myself from that. But a month later, due to some family conflict, hint that shows up in there, I just went into this like rage, Nicole. And those who don't know me, like, that was so out of my norm.
Yeah, I can't see that, but I believe you. Yeah.
I was cussing and screaming at my brothers. I hung up on my mom. I was yelling at my husband and my kids. I had just lost it. I mean, just lost it, like, so irrational. And I sat back and I said, okay, I need some help. So I went to a therapist. And by the way, as I share this, love therapists, love medical professionals. They are there to help. And part of the reason I share my story is this is not the only way to be able to process through grief. And this is the way that people normally process through. I do it. And also, we also may be harmed by that. So as I continue my story, those who are listening, just take agency, take control, take information, and be able to decipher what is it I truly need for myself. Okay, before I continue.
Right. I couldn't agree with you more.
So I went to see the therapist, who I think was also a new therapist. And I shared my story, everything that led up to that day, including my dad's passing. And now there actually is in the DSM a designation of prolonged grief disorder, which I may not have fit at that point in time, but I definitely was going through grief. But that's not necessarily what she walked away with. She basically labeled me with situational anxiety and sent me off to an anxiety group support, which none of which helped. And I got labeled. It's still
Yeah.
sitting in my profile as situational anxiety. That does not help. But how many people, let's even talk about the body keeps the score. I have it over here. Dr. Basil van der Kolk, as a psychotherapist, talks about the fact that how many people go to get help and instead they just get labeled and prescribed drugs when
Right.
really it's not dealing with the root cause. That didn't help. So then I thought I'd go to see a doctor because I was in my early 40s at that time, thinking maybe it was hormonal that I was acting this way. And within 2 minutes, the doctor cut me off and prescribed me medications. Okay, I resisted. Then I went to a 7-day destination spa, which Nicole, by the way, it was absolutely amazing. Got away from everything, got to relax, got massages, facials, got to exercise, eat healthy food. It was absolutely wonderful. Then within 2 hours of being home, I was bickering with my loving husband again.
Wow.
And I tell those stories too, because at that point in time, it's kind of like going to a professional. I know they were doing the best they could with the resources they are having, but like having a carpenter with a hammer, they're only going to be looking for the nails, right? What kind of diagnosis can I give based briefly on what that person's presenting problems are? When with grief, it can show up in so many different ways. So this is also another way to let people know that there are other ways to process their grief. Grief shows up in various different ways. It's any kind of significant loss that shows up in our life. It could be a relationship. It could be a loss of a job. It could be, in your case, it was the stillbirth that was happening. It could be a loss of identity. Even with the myth of normal, Dr. Gabor Mate, who I also reference as a physician, he found that a number of women who had were showing up with autoimmune disorders. And when he went back to ask more about what was going on in their life, was finding out that they had lost their identity after, who am I after my last child leaves for college? Who am I when I just got divorced? Who am I when I just stepped out of the work environment? Who am I when my parents pass away? So that sense of identity as to who am I, which is my phrase. I thought it was Dr. Gabor Mate, but when I went back to listen to the podcast, it wasn't. So my phrase based on that is loss of identity leads to pathology.
Yes. And that's true. And we morph so many times over a lifetime. It's like, was that a real person I was? Who am I now? And, one of the biggest lessons I've learned on my journey with losing people and losing a baby is there's no time frame on grief. There is no right or wrong way. There's no limits. It is all so personal that when someone comes up to you and says, oh, well, you're going to need to get over that. No, you don't. Everything remains inside of you. It's how you deal with it. But a loss, my mom passed away over 10 years ago. And there are still like times that I will see something or feel something or just want to pick up the phone. And I'm like, oh, that hurts. That hurts. I would always tell my niece, oh, my mom would know the answer to that. So I think it's just a lifelong thing. And very quickly, with grief, how do you tell someone that you're not doing it right or wrong, you're just doing you? And talk about why the minute you're born, you're heading towards dying at some point.
Yeah.
Why do we not look at death differently? From a standpoint of that is just part of it. I think it should be addressed differently. How do you feel about that?
I love it, Nicole. You asked me about 3 or 4 different questions.
I know. And I have about 10 more.
No, I know. And here I went on a bit because, I love this topic. So I'm going to address that. So we live in a death avoidant culture.
True.
Let's start there, which gets into the subtext of healthy grief, normalizing and navigating loss in a culture of toxic positivity. It's actually written in the United States, it's written into the Declaration of Independence the pursuit of happiness. Like anything that's not happy is considered bad. So if somebody is grieving over a loss, even the loss of a pet, then something must be wrong with you or wrong with me, right? If I'm grieving. So part of this normalizing and navigating is recognizing, just as you mentioned, grief is a healthy, natural process to grieve about. And also, when we are born, at some point, there will be an expiration. We just don't have it printed on our head like we do on the bottom of a milk jug, for example.
Right.
We don't know when that is. It doesn't say used by or expired by, and it should have, stamped on our bottom when we're born is continue to use, right? Continue to use until expired, and continue to live our life until that day that we pass, knowing that at some point we all will expire. If we knew that also with the ones that are around us, our loved ones, we might also appreciate them more, right? Thinking for
Absolutely.
when we have those, especially those that are elderly in general, that we know that are on the process of expiring, we tend to appreciate them more. I know I did that with my mom for the last 5 years of her life, and she passed away at the young age of 97 and a half years young, right? So the last 5 years after her stroke is I knew every day was precious. I never knew the last time that I was going to see her. But Anne, back to your question is, and part of it I just mentioned, we're in a death avoidance society in the United States, because this doesn't happen for all cultures. There are other cultures that are more open to and acknowledging of death, but in traditional, for us in the United States, more death avoidance. Anything that's not happy is bad, right? And then when we're going through grief, there must be something wrong with us. So let's send us off to the therapist to get labeled, to get the drugs, just something that numbs us down, or even for us, let me find that quick fix to be able to get through it. However, something you just mentioned, even in regards to your mother and the loss of your mother too, is what does it mean? This is another typical question I'm asked. How do I know when I have healthfully processed through my grief? Which is the reason why I titled the book Healthy Grief. We'll all experience grief, but how do we do it healthfully? And healthfully is acknowledging that I have a loss, acknowledging that there is an emotional process that I'm going through, acknowledging that it will take time to process through that. And just as you mentioned, it's going to be different for everybody. The time frame is going to be different. And that's the reason why in Healthy Grief, I provide a 5-stage process to be able to help us process through and process through in our own unique way. Hence the reason why, and you're one of them, and I'm one of them, is what are the 30 grief survival case studies in here? So what I do is I lay out the 5-stage framework. And then with those stories, there's a review at each of those stories. So for the reader, you can see, for example, Nicole, how did you, and then I use the 5-stage framework. What were those thoughts? What were those feelings? What type of support did you get? What action steps did you take? What did the next phase, that new normal, look like for you? So any reader who is looking at this can also gravitate to certain stories, gravitate to certain people. And what I say, on their path to their own grief journey, can pull pieces to create the stepping stones along their own path that is within that framework and those own stories. So they're like, oh, I love the way that Nicole really sought out, for example, the nurse. You told a story about the nurse.
Right,
the nurse with you, right? Maybe they related to the way in which people reacted around you, not giving away your whole story. People reacted around you on that day of your loss, not acknowledging it, for example.
Oh, crazy. Crazy.
So whatever it is the stories themselves. In fact, 2/3 of this book are the stories that are in there, so people can pick out the pieces to lay down their own stepping stones to their own path within the framework that's in there to help them.
Oh, Karen, we could talk about this for hours. I could anyway. I mean, that it's just like I said, being able to write was so helpful. But, we're at the end of our time. Tell people where they can get this most important book.
Yes, the easiest is to go to my website, which is basically my name as you see it on there without the dot. It is Dr. Karen Kramer. So Dr. Karen Kramer without the dot. And what you'll find when you go to my page, there is a ribbon right towards the top that says Discover Healthy Grief. That will take you to a link to the page. It has a book trailer to tell you more about what's in the book. It has the book reviews, and also since it has a foreword by Jack Canfield's interview, and some snippets of that are on that page as well as resources to go ahead and purchase whatever form of the book that you want, hardcover, paperback, as well as the ebook format. And by the way, hint, hint, people have been asking me, gee, Karen, is it an audio format? It is not an audio format yet. However, when you do purchase the book, because Nicole, you're part of this, when you purchase the book, this gives you a link that goes to the resource page, and on the resource page, every one of the grief survival case study stories, like Nicole's, like mine, we actually read our stories. And one of the frameworks that I gave was to say, imagine that the reader is sitting across that couch from you, across that Starbucks table, and just read it. So I know I broke down crying in the middle of my story. I know some people have stumbled over words, added more things in it. So those are in the book as well.
Yes, and it is a wonderful book, and it's so needed in our society right now. So anyone who is watching this, I would highly, I have my book right here as well, Karen. I know you can. Yay. So, it's almost like something you can refer to. You can find something that will resonate with you in there. So it has been just a pleasure interviewing you, and what you do is so important. And I just want to thank you for being on today. You're amazing. I adore you. And I'm so happy we all met at the Change book, writing our little stories in there. It has become such a fun family to be a part of. So Karen, thank you so much for being here today. And to our viewer, touch bases with Karen. I've got a link in there for your Villa Vision Center. And thanks again for being my guest today. I so appreciate it.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you to everybody else. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Nicole Harvick, and this is my co-host,
Rachel Best. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.